to see you. Yeah. Yeah. So we are already recording, just to inform you, each of you. Very nice to see you all here for one more session of our seminar. So just to introduce the seminar for people in the physical room and people from the Zoom room. Just some few words about the seminar, and after about this today's session. So this seminar is the Social Movements and Political Action monthly seminar, was created in 2014. We have had many different sessions in these years. You can imagine it's a monthly seminar, so we are having sessions since October 2014. So we have had many different topics. Since here in our website you can see the different events we hosted, and since the pandemic we started being online or hybrid, so we have also the video for each session. Sometime just in the case the speaker wasn't happy with the recording the session, we didn't upload the video. So just in very specific case we don't have the video of the session, but in general we have, and you can find the video. Well, I just choose one of the seminar we don't have, but for instance here you click here, you open the page of the seminar, and you can have also all the videos of the previous events that maybe are interesting for you. This session of today we are very happy to have with us Angela Adami. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are very happy to have you here. With this very fresh research that is bringing to your dissertation, the research for your PhD dissertation. And Angela will talk about from past storylines to present moves, a micro-temporal approach to migrants, collective action. I'm saying yes, absolutely, because this is the most important part, at least for our seminar. Angela, she's a PhD candidate in political science and sociology at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. She's part of the Cosmos Research Center. In the last few years, her work focused on migration, border regimes, migrant struggles in Italy, which you know is a very specific and dedicated and critical case. As well on the study of neo-fascist and extreme right movement groups that are also, as you know, are critically connected also, I think, to the topic of migrants collective action. And her present PhD project is centered on the study of migrants collective action through a temporal approach, focusing particularly on collective memory, political trajectories, collective identities, and political belonging. So thank you very much for joining us. I give you the floor. I just share your PowerPoint here, and just please send from sorry, if you confirm from the Zoom room if you can see correctly the PowerPoint, if everything is fine, if you are able to hear me well. Everything is fine? I think so. Okay, so you have the floor, Angela. And thank you very much. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. And
in the virtual room and taking some time to like listen to my research and engage with it hopefully later. So this presentation, as Guya was saying, is part of a broader research project, which is the PhD that I'm about to finalize, fingers crossed. And today I'm talking about political biographies of migrants who engage in collective action. The title of today's presentation is From Past Storylines to Present Moves, a micro-temporal approach to migrants' collective action. I will start by briefly introducing the relevant literature that works as a framework for my study and focus on why a temporal approach. So why is that useful and what it sheds light on? And then I'll shortly go through the methodology and the case selection before moving on to the central part of today's presentation, which is the narrative analysis of migrants' political biography. And I finally discuss some of the main findings in the concluding remarks. So aside from a few major protests, such as the Sans-Papiers movement in France and the immigrants' rights movement and the Dreamers movement in the US, scholars of social movement studies have largely neglected migrants' collective action. Traditional theories of mobilization and social change have regarded forms of migrants' collective action as anomalies and as exceptions as a result of closed political opportunities, the lack of resources, and in general, a difficulty in framing favorable discourses around migration. However, recently, some scholars started to notice a proliferation of different forms of migrant struggles and migrants' collective action across Western countries. And especially, in Europe, with the so-called long summer of migration, scholars have increasingly started an intense dialogue with critical studies of border and citizenship. This has been an important dialogue that has pushed social movement scholars to revisit some of the key categories through which they approach collective action. In particular, the spatial dimension and the focus on spatialities have been central in this scholarly work. So scholars were focusing on borderlines, camps, migratory routes as key sites of struggle, but also and in particular on cities and urban contexts as the preferred spaces in which protests would scale up and alliances would become possible. So, but why a temporal approach then? So first off, time and temporal lenses can mean very, very different things. What I'm focusing on in my research is a micro-temporal approach. In particular, for today's presentation, I'm focusing on the biographical time. Scholars have noticed how migrants' collective action is characterized by volatility and by ephemeral forms, we could say. This, however, does not mean that nothing exists in between times and spaces of visible mobilization. So the biographical time helps us access to those blind spots. Another element that I think the micro-temporal approach that I'm trying to outline helps us see better is how migrants often find themselves locked in an eternal present. So one remains first and foremost a migrant whose very existence is tied to the moment of migration to which he or she is continuously brought back to. On the contrary, the focus on biographical time goes beyond the experience of migration itself and tries to incorporate a number of other spheres of people's life as significant for present-day forms of mobilizations. In particular, a micro-temporal approach allows us to consider how temporalities are mobilized by migrants who participate in collective action to motivate and to sustain their engagement in the present. So just very briefly, I conducted a multi-sited ethnography in three cities in Italy, in Naples, in Rome, and in Bologna. for around 6 months in each city. And I was then collecting life histories and other interviews with people with a migration background. And for today's presentation, I'm focusing in particular on the analysis of these life histories, which I conceptualize as political biographies. And then in terms of analysis, I conducted a practices and narrative analysis. And today I'm presenting this narrative analysis. And finally, more broadly, let's say the study is located in between the micro and the meso levels, so as to avoid treating these groups that I'm looking at as like discrete groups with somewhat like strong boundaries, which isn't usually the case for collective action in general, and even less so in the case of migrants mobilizing. And I am focusing on the micro level today. I'm not going through the whole case selection presentation, but just to give you a sense of like who I was talking to mostly. The Migrants Coordination in Bologna, the Refugees and Migrants Movement in Naples, and the Network of Migrant Women and Daughters in Rome. As you can see, something that's relevant for like the analysis that I will present just now is how the three groups, all of them use the term migrant in their public representation. But let's move on to the part of the analysis. So the analysis of political biographies is helpful to understand how certain pasts and not others are selected and how they are organized as significant building blocks of political trajectories by participants in ways that help make sense and sustain engagement in collective action in the present. The analysis sheds light on what are the triggers of mobilization, how these are framed as breaks or continuities with the past, what role migration plays in political engagement. And the analysis also provides important insights on the paths of resocialization. So it is now commonly acknowledged by scholars of political socialization that early socialization does not deterministically explain political behavior. Rather, scholars refer to a multi-stage process where certain experiences in adulthood also have a socializing effect. So interestingly enough, both participation in movement and migration have been looked at as key sites of resocialization, but these two experiences have hardly ever been explored together. So here we also wish to understand how being a migrant and participating in collective action intertwine. So the analysis of political biographies is useful also to retrace these paths of political resocialization across different geographical, social, and political contexts. And I think that this can help us understand how these processes of resocialization have an impact on the decision to mobilize, on the forms that mobilization take, and also on the timing. So when is it that people decide that that's a good time for like mobilizing in a new country? Virtually all scholars working on narratives have highlighted how narratives are strictly tied to time and temporality. So narratives have this temporally configurative capacity. And in this sense, Ricord famously talks about the capacity of narratives to organize events into a plot. And he writes, "The world unfolded by every narrative work is always a temporal world. And time becomes human time to the extent that it is organized after the manner of narrative." So the analysis that I try to provide here focuses on both content and shape of the political biographies collected. And in particular, I try to present three shapes, so three types of narrative shapes, which are watersheds, continuities in the narration, and simultaneity across space. I wanted to show you some examples, so it's also clearer how I conducted the analysis. Watersheds can be singled out in the analysis whenever the timeline of narration is abruptly interrupted. So these are occurrences that act as turning points in political trajectories, having a transformative capacity, causing a shift in the meaning and value orientation and triggering mobilization. So to give you an example of this, these are respondents from the Migrant Women and Daughters Network in Rome. And she was telling me how she decided that from that moment on, she would only mobilize with people with a migration background. And this was like an assembly with other feminists, Italian feminists in Rome. Once I read, during one of those meetings, they were asking themselves how come none of the migrant women they had invited had shown up. At that time, the network of migrant women and daughters didn't exist yet. And one goes like, well, we've invited them, our space is open. And she said it in such a way, just like saying, well, if they don't come, it's because they don't want to. And then I stood up. I wasn't even marked on the intervention list. And I said in one go, I'll be very short. Let me just ask you a question. Have you ever done anything for migrant women to actually be here? And silence fell, and many people said no with their heads. So this is quite straightforward, I think, how this is an example of watershed. So it's a break in the narration. And then she says that like after that, she would contact other people with a migration background and they would start organizing together. Continuity. Narrative shapes of continuity are framed as a natural extension of what happened in the past. And these are occurrences, skills, experiences that work as connecting lines with the past. What is relevant here, I think, is to notice how the decision to mobilize, the decision to participate in collective action is not simply the result of triggers, turning points, or abrupt changes, but it is also grounded in a search for a sense of familiarity and coherence with the past. So in this quote I put here, what we will read in a second is how the heritage of this person's past is not really working as a trigger, but it is qualifying the way in which she understands politics and the quality of how she does, she participates in the struggle. And this respondent told me, look, I certainly have this great luck. Let's say now I call it heritage, but that's not the word that I'd like to use. A restitution that comes from my reference community, the Eritrean community that settled in Italy. I lived how they lived the relationship with being a diaspora, and how even within a space that is not their territory, they always organized. Because in those years, when I was born, there was the organization of the Popular Front. This thing, it was my community that gave it to me, the feeling of unique body. And so we could say that I am myself a little bit of a carrier of this. So she's saying how she values community building, attention to the ways in which relationships are built within the local movement area, in a way that like takes on this heritage and is somewhat opposing the ways in which things are being done in Rome. Finally, the last narrative shape considered is simultaneity across space. So while both watersheds and continuities are narrative types that can be easily retraced in most biographical accounts because of the ways in which we tell our stories, I maintain that simultaneity across space is specific of migrants' political biographies. And this is strictly connected to what I was mentioning before about the resocializing role played by both migration and participation in movements across different contexts. Simultaneity across space can be singled out whenever we notice a bifurcation in the timeline, as respondents are looking at one context through the eyes of the other. This is related to the simultaneous availability of multiple backgrounds against which people can evaluate events and circumstances as a result of this double resocialization that I was talking about. So this respondent is like former leader of the young section of the Communist Party in Mauritania that then had to flee for political reasons. And he says, Italy is a democratic country where people have the right to speak, demonstrate, they can do whatever they want, except Italians in this period don't want to do anything. We still don't have the freedom to speak, but from time to time we do something. Whenever we organize big demonstrations, they can take people, leaders to jail. So from time to time I was taken to jail. I was supposed to finish university in 4 years. It took me 7 because whenever I had an exam, I was often in jail. Here, the respondent is talking about different degrees of freedom to participate in politics. One of the reasons why social movement scholars would predict that migrants don't participate in movements is because they objectively risk more. So why is that relevant? I think this shows how the evaluation of risks, the degree of exposure to state violence and repression is a matter of perception, but this we kind of already know. Here, what we say is that this perception is grounded in experiences that are happening across different contexts. So, for example, for respondents who had previous political experiences in their countries of origin, most of the time, Italy is not perceived as a risky country, and notwithstanding their present-day precarious economic and legal status. So moving on to the conclusions, we talked about watersheds and how they matter in relation to triggering events for mobilization, continuity and the search for familiarity and simultaneity as a question of how perceptions are based upon multiple sociopolitical backgrounds. But let me just go through these 3 points a little more into detail. Also talking about more broadly about the findings, let's say, of the research. So first, in terms of watershed, what emerged was that migration is not the major trigger for mobilization. Migration indeed is often framed in the biographies that I collected as a rupture, sometimes corresponding to a traumatic moment, but it is hardly ever connected to the decision to mobilize. And I think this is relevant, especially if we consider that the groups who participated in the research all mobilize in the public discourse as migrants. And they use this collective identity in public representation. So this clearly raises new questions that concern the mismatch between forms of public representation and forms of internal identifications upon which a sense of belonging is then built. Continuity is relevant for the search for familiarity and coherence with the past, which are at least as important in the decision to mobilize. This is relevant, I think, because oftentimes migration is exclusively depicted as a spatial break. And there is a considerable underestimation of the efforts that subjects make to keep an internal coherence and unity of sense in what they do, how they live, and how they do things. In this sense, I think a temporal approach is useful to understand how it is not only as a result of a break or a trigger that people decide to participate in movements, but also in search for familiarity and coherence with the past. And finally, simultaneity is relevant, as I was saying, in relation to the perception of risk, violence, and repression, and how these are calculated against multiple sociopolitical backgrounds. My take on multi-stage processes of political socialization is that these should not be understood in a progressive way. Like back then I thought so, and now I think in this other way. But rather, different grounds, levels, and contexts of interpretation of social reality remain simultaneously available to migrants over time. So in order to explore the willingness, the timing, and the forms of participation of migrants, it is necessary to know against what backgrounds a certain event is being evaluated and understood. Oh, this is not supposed to be there. Yeah, this is like this picture is an occupied lake in Rome that was very important for my research, because there is where I was having a long conversation with one of the people that participated in the research, and in Italian it's called Il lago che combatte, the lake that struggles. And I wanted to close with this part, because sometimes with like the efforts to analyze things, then we take out a lot of like the aesthetics and the beautiful parts of doing research. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angela. I want to touch it so that people can see you finally. Yeah, so finally you can see Angela, because until now you couldn't see my PowerPoint. So thank you very much for this very interesting and also emotional presentation. I think there are many things that are also brings not just reflection but also emotions. And so I like to open now the debate, to give the word to the floor. If there are comments, questions from the virtual room, from the room, physical room, this is the moment. So we already have some questions from the room here. Yeah, it's you, Luca. I just wanted to find a way for you for the people that are also hearing your questions. So maybe you can
Use a microphone.
you can just try and yeah.
I can go there, yeah.
Really?
I don't know if it's possible.
No, you can come close and
Hello, Anna. Angela, thank you for this very interesting presentation. So during your presentation, I was wondering about three things, and I would like to ask you if you can speak a bit more about these three points. The first one, I was wondering about the profile of these migrants. Like if you could see some similarities or other cleavages more than being immigrant, like a class cleavage or something like that. Mm-hmm. The second point was the connection that these people have with other social movements. If you found that there are parts of other movements or just in this network, or how these people are connected to other social movements. And the third point that I was wondering during your presentation was, first, I would like to ask to you if the three movements that you investigated was in Italy, no?
Yes.
Do you think that this position of these immigrants is, like, in what way this kind of position is connected to the cultural and political context of Italy? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Maybe we collect some more questions. Thank you very much, Luca. Luca is a PhD student here at CIES-Iscte in urban studies, if I'm not wrong. But so maybe we collect some more few questions if you prefer to answer. If
there are others who are.
Some more questions?
I have one.
Cloud.
To connect me.
Maybe it's better to be close to this.
To connect with the second question that Luca made, I just saw in the presentation there is some picture from some squats in Rome, in Lisbon, in Naples, and I want to know if you study also the connection that exists between the migrant movements and squat movements in Italy.
Well, no, if there are no other, I'll jump in with a question. Can you hear me all right?
Perfect.
So what I didn't really hear in the different biographies was some generator of the anger and indignation that we usually expect when people mobilize for protest. Whether those really are the motivating factors or whether people find it convenient later to find these triggers, they usually have some events that they can point to and say, you know, this is where our hopes were dashed. This is the villain who did something to us. These are the victims that we're acting on behalf of. In other words, the emotional push that narratives are very good at generating, especially autobiographies and biographies. So I had trouble connecting that with the three types that you mentioned. And so I would especially be interested in, you know, if there's one particular kind of narrative that generates a lot of that motivating energy, that emotional energy better than the others do. But for all three, I'd like to hear more, I guess, about, you know, why people are taking the time and energy to get out there, and then again, the emotions they're feeling. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So maybe now is the time you already have a lot of food for thinking.
Thank you for the questions. So in terms of profile of the people who decided to participate, so both like the three groups, but also in general, participants were extremely heterogeneous in terms of countries of origin, gender also, not so much in terms of class, like most people were from the lower classes, and like I think one of the things that my research looks at, but not in today's presentation, was an attempt to understand how come people with such heterogeneous backgrounds and such heterogeneous stories come together. So another part of my research looks at the ways in which these groups build a social past, so collective memory that they can refer back to, because that's something a little bit like a common linguistic code, is something that we usually give for granted. Like we assume, I don't know, like for activists, we were talking about this earlier, in Italy, Genova 2001 is like something that everyone knows what it means. So it's part of a social past that it's there and it's not really discussed. So in the case of migrants mobilizing, this is not always the case. So like I was looking at the ways in which a social past and processes of collective memory were being constructed. In terms of connection with other social movements, so we could like make a distinction if we want. So all three groups are actually, we could say they're part of the local movement areas in the ways that Melucci defined movement areas in like broad terms. But some of them, like the case in Bologna and the case in Naples, which were respectively starting to mobilize in 2004 and 2016, are more strictly connected to some groups that were already there of local activists. Whereas, and this is something new for the context of Italy, the network of migrant women and daughters, which is like a much smaller group, emerged with a specific need to like separate. So it is separatist both on the lines of gender and migration background. So it was quite interesting to talk to them and understand their reasons, and like they are separatist, but they are connected to groups in conflicting and critical, but also alliance kind of ways. So for example, I was in Porto Fluviale, which is one of the pictures that was in the presentation, because they were given a room within that squad by the Movimento per la Casa, so the housing movement in Italy, but on the premises that they would be completely free to do their own activities. So like these things are negotiated really on a daily basis, I would say. Whether the cultural and the political context of Italy matters, yes, it matters. If I had focused on diasporic communities, politics, then maybe the context of the country of origin would have had a much stronger weight. It still does. So what we see, for example, is that like if things are happening in Peru, people then mobilize more also in these more heterogeneous groups that are like active on migrants' rights in Italy. So, or for example, the feminist movement that came from Latin America was like functioning as a trigger for people that did not mobilize when they were back in Latin America, but they were like looking at what's happening in my country of origin and then looking for something similar in Italy. And in terms of emotions, definitely it's something that I wasn't bringing up, but it's obviously there when we talk about triggers and what emotions would trigger mobilizations. When I looked at the processes of collective memory building, I was trying to frame this collective memory construction as a process of affective community construction. And I think that like what emerges more from my data, but that's because I wasn't looking at moments of protest, but I was looking at the ways in which these groups are slowly being built up, relationships are being built like in latent periods, let's say, is like the element of belonging. So I think that, for example, one pattern that I wasn't discussing today, but because I'm still thinking about it, is that trajectories of the people that I interview differ according to these things. So people that participated in politics in their countries of origin started mobilizing in Italy almost right away. And this emerges as a search for something that you know already, like you understand the mechanism of the struggle, you look for networks that like resonate with what you were doing in the past, and so I would say like in this case a search for a sense of belonging is what works as a trigger for participation. Whereas in the case of people who did not mobilize in their countries of origin, migration poses like, unless something big happens in between, of course, then that's a different type of thing. But like generally migration is a moment of a big traumatic experience. And usually people told me that they would start mobilizing 2-3 years after arriving to Italy, because before that they had more important things to do and they perceived that they would risk. Whereas in the case of people who, like the quote that I put about the person from Mauritania, I was like telling me, look, I was taken to jail every 2 months. It doesn't feel like it's unsafe to mobilize here. We go in the street and we say like, we want citizenship rights, and that's fine. So I think I covered all the points.
I think so. Yeah. We have not really questions. Well, one is more a question, and even if it's going to be connected to what you just say now, But if there is someone else who want to ask something, I can do it. Okay. So, we have one more question from the room. Thank you for coming close, just because I think that I'm not so used to this room, and so go ahead.
Thank you for presenting your work. My question is that, normally we see in cities that migrants concentrate in specific neighborhoods. So whether you observed that the migrants that mobilized came from the same area of the city, or if it was from different citywide, different areas around the city that mobilized in some areas. So we more like the residential points of the migrants that mobilized. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, maybe now I will.
Can I?
Yes, Tiago, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this presentation, Angela. It was great to see your work and what you're doing. A lot of the questions that I had were already asked. So, namely, the last one I was going to ask you, what's the importance of space and location for these groups and their mobilization. So one of the things that I have here is more methodological. It's how many, I guess you were doing ethnography, so you had a lot of conversations, but did you do also interviews, and how many interviews did you do? And then, because all my questions were asked already, in a way, the other question that I had as well was, your work reminded me a lot of the work of, not exactly the same, but very close in a way to the work of Felipe Santos on the work that he has done with the PA. It was like looking into the internal, at the micro level, at the work that the organization did for politicizing, because the PA was connected with housing, to politicize people that had housing problems. So I was wondering, do these groups that you focused on had any kind of setup work that they would take people that would get into the organization to politicize them as well? And if you saw any differences across the multiple sites of ethnography that you had. And those are my questions. Thank you so much.
Maybe if you don't mind, and if there are not too many things, I would like to jump on Tiago's question, just because it's a little bit connected to what you were saying, and a little bit also what you were saying before. About this, and also about the work of Felipe, that is about PAC, that you mentioned, and it is, I think is very, very important. And also a little bit about what James was saying about emotions, because I think it's interesting what you say, that there are other kind of emotions that are more related to feeling of protection sometime, or sharing the risk, or that are also brought by activists. That sometimes are very important. We saw this in housing movement, and this was very strong, interesting study by Felipe, for instance, but also Marcus Angelovici and other scholars about this thing that is true, that engagement and activism take energies, but also bring energies. So people that are in situation of strong vulnerability, under risk, for instance, of eviction, or for instance, they live in slums and under risk of demolition of slums. That is something that people here in the room know very well. Certain people that are studying this or activists in this area. So the fact to be part of a movement or of an activist organization, or at least to be participate in some way, is something that helps to share the risk. So it's very important for, I remember a presentation by Marcus Angelovici that he was following activists that were working with vulnerable people that were waiting the implementation of an eviction order.
So it was following these moments, and the fact that they were collectivized, these moments were socialized with other people, was a way to contain the stressful of the situation. And so sometimes we connect activism with the risk, but there are certain situations where actually activism is a protection from the risk. And I think that this is very interesting. Also, I have the impression this also emerged from what you say in a certain point. And so, of course, this brings a lot of different emotions in a certain way, so that you mobilize. So, of course, there is rage and this feeling of outrage, and all these feelings, but also at a certain moment, the need to feel protected, to feel that your feelings are collectivized and socialized, and because the risk of certain situations are very strong. We see this in a housing movement. The risk of eviction under which many people live is very stressful, and the fact to be part of our organization and to share this is a relief from this risk in a certain way, because you know that there is, if something happens, you can also go to someone else, and you can have the activists intervene and protect you from the police, or so I think this is very interesting, and I don't know if maybe this is can be a little bit connected to what you say. And after what you were saying also about the trauma, of course, when you study trajectories among migrants, you have the point of the moment of the migration. So there is a break in the trajectory that actually can, as you say, can be. So I think it's something very different to study trajectory. Well, you have this also when you study trajectories of activities that went in prison. You have moments of trauma. But actually, how these actually. There are certain people that leave engagement because of this, or certain people that start to be engaged because of this. So there is the effects of this are really diverse. So we cannot have a pattern of this. But if you felt, so partially you already answered this when you mentioned the trauma, but I wanted to understand more if you have this if you saw this dimension of a break in the trajectories. Yeah, just this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So in terms of like neighborhoods, this was more visible in Naples and in Bologna, whereas in Rome, so like in Naples and in Bologna, both groups were mostly active in popular neighborhoods, but also this is complicated because of processes of gentrification. These neighborhoods are quickly transforming also. So yeah, that was definitely there. In the case of Rome, Rome is a huge city, and people from the network were coming from different parts of Rome, and they were most of the time living very much in the outskirts of the city. So it was really complicated also for them to meet. To give you an example of like what it meant to actually carry out the ethnography. So they were telling me at some point, so we're gonna meet the next Sunday that it's sunny at the Circo Massimo. Okay, it rained for 3 Sundays in a row. So like they wouldn't meet. That's like because they would come all to the city center, and that would be an easy place for them to meet. But in their specific case, it was different. But like I wouldn't generalize this. I think it's specific of the groups that I looked at. Tiago, so I was collecting around 40 interviews, but 20 of them are life histories with people with a migration background. They have been very challenging interviews, but also very interesting. And in terms of patterns of politicization, I think in certain groups, these attempt to politicize the migrant component is more present. In other groups, there is another strategy, which is like relying more on people with a migration background who also participated in politics in the past, who had past political experiences in their countries of origin, but also have the experience of migration and have a better access to the problems that migrants had. For example, in following 2015, in the reception centers, there were small protests all around, very much scattered. And the case in Naples was like organizing these small protests into a bigger group that then became the group that I was doing research with. And there, the role of people who had a past political experience was central. And in the case in Rome, instead, there is more of a question of what it is that we call political, and this I think connects also to partly to one of your questions. So there is a strong attempt not to reduce political action to whatever is militant, just militant. So people would value other type of life experiences as inherently political, and there would not be like this distinction between attempts to politicize or call yourself a feminist. There is also all this reflection about the terms. So to what extent a feminist is a feminist because he or she would call herself a feminist, or is it because of the experiences that she had in her life? So all this reflection is more of something that comes out of the group in Rome. And I think it's interesting and relevant also in analytical terms, because in a way, I think migrants agency rather than migrants collective action is challenging for our understanding of the category of political. For example, scholars of autonomy of migration have highlighted how the very act of like crossing borders is political. So it's more complicated, I think, in this case than just internal dynamics and attempts to transform relationships or like ways of participation into strictly militant forms of participation. On protection and sharing the risk, definitely this thing was there. For example, in the case in Rome, one thing that was really interesting was how this mostly worked as a solidarity network. There was a solidarity network that was somehow like across generations of migration, because it's a network of migrant women and daughters, and it was mostly the daughters that would take care of the mothers. So it wasn't like actually related people, but they were like daughters saying, well, I think, I don't know if my aunt or my mother, when she arrived, had like a group like ours, things would have been so much better for her. So there's definitely this also like the fact of referring back to family, which is usually mobilized as a type of like
politics of care.
Yeah, this politics of care. But like I come from Verona, where the World Congress of Family was held. So usually in politics, family like recalls of like something different, like also traditional and backward-leaning values. And I think it was interesting to look at the ways in which they instead mobilized this idea of family as like a rebuilding of social ties in solidaristic ways. And trauma is very complicated because traumatic experiences are silenced. So you don't know much about, like people don't tell you traumas, rightly so, and also they don't really want to, like, it depends on like their life experiences. So it is mostly something that emerges from the ethnographic part rather than the life histories, I would say. Like when people see you there for quite a bit, some things emerge. So, for example, how certain decisions were made over like how much to expose certain people. For example, some migrants would act as like the speakers publicly, but then this would backfire against them for their like achievement of the legal status. So like strategies were being like recalibrated on these grounds, but these are things that are yeah, really difficult. Like I am still looking for someone who was like actually able to analyze trauma, because I have tried to read the things, but it's really challenging, I think.
We have some more questions, comments. So you want to, there is something you would like to add to the general?
No, I just wanted to thank you for like asking me so many questions. I think it's nice to yeah.
No, thank you for your answers and for give us the opportunity to reflect on these things, which is for people working on housing movements also is very important, because as I was telling you before, well, in any country there is a big connection between migrant movements and activism and housing movements. In the case of Portugal, it's very important because one of the main housing associations was born inside the migrant movement. So it's very, very important. There is a very important connection, and there are very important similarities. So what you wrote here today is very important and interesting for us. So maybe if we don't have more questions, we close here. We still don't have yet a date for the next session, but we will keep you informed and updated about the future. For sure, we will have 2 more sessions before the summer in June and July, but you know, this is a kind of how to manage it and seminar and without funds. So this is also our management of risk and of the task, but it's also the nice part of the seminar, I think. And so, but this sometimes has some impact on the planning. But you will keep updated about the next sessions. And thank you very much for coming here today and for the participating in the discussion. And see you the next time. Bye bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Chiudo qua.
Yeah.